As students of composition go through the many phases of their training, they're aiming to learn many different things. First, the focus is naturally quite local on details of harmony and counterpoint, and then on orchestration. When the beginning composer starts composing actual pieces, normally they'll progress from short, simple forms to more elaborate and complex structures. Even if composition training is done in the traditional way, starting, say, with a simple ternary form, then moving on to sonata form, it's important to always think in terms of more general formal principles: unity, development, contrast, effective beginnings and endings, and so on. All the standard forms display these principles simply because they're based on human psychology. Nobody wants to spend an hour listening to the same idea repeated 1,000 times with no variation. Nobody wants to listen to random noise for an hour either. Although some composers have experimented with these things, the actual results are not very appealing to the average music lover. It is true that some music is minimal in one dimension or another, but if the music is minimal in all dimensions, it simply has no interest. A much better kind of minimalism is to freeze one dimension, but then to make the others especially rich. For example, there are many Bach fugues that stay in the same tempo and move in 16th notes throughout, but their harmonic and textual richness justify these rhythmic limitations. And even in these cases, once we look at the way the music is structured beyond the actual note values, we quickly find that the phrasing, the texture, and many details of harmony are not at all simplistic, quite the contrary. In a sense, the simplicity of one dimension lets the other dimensions take precedence. This is just one example of looking at the principles of musical form from a psychological point of view. When we speak of a composer having a good sense of form, it doesn't mean that they just blindly use conventional forms. Quite the contrary. Having a sense of form means developing a sense for how the form derives from the musical idea or ideas, and having a feeling for what is required at any given moment. There's often more than one solution in a given situation, but there are also solutions that don't make sense. Elliott Carter used to talk about convincing continuity. This is a very useful notion in pretty much any style. Just as in a conversation with other people, if you're constantly changing the subject without any connection between one idea and the next, the listener gets lost and loses interest. Convincing continuity means, in effect, creating clearly audible associations between two successive moments. That means that even though there may be something surprising arriving, there must also be some clearly audible connection with what came before. It might be tempo, voice leading, timbre, harmony, a motive. Any dimension of music can be used to connect successive moments, but the composer needs to know how to create these associations. This is the most basic and elementary aspect of the sense of form. So, convincing continuity is first and foremost about immediate associations. Over a longer term, other requirements come into play. Contrast is the first one. The degree of contrast is important here. If all the contrasts in a piece have the same degree of novelty, the form will feel like it's bumping. In any larger work, you'll need different degrees of contrast, rather like different degrees of punctuation in writing. A new paragraph has a stronger punctuation than a comma within one sentence. Within a given section of the piece, the degree of contrast will be fairly mild. This is just another way of saying that within a given section, we should feel a certain unity, coherence. I call this formal stability. But after a certain amount of time, we need more contrast. This doesn't mean there's been no connection between the ideas, just that the degree of contrast will be greater and may even require some kind of gradual transition. Now, there are many possibilities for creating any given degree of contrast, since contrast can be the result of all the various dimensions of the music. For example, having string players suddenly sing for 1 minute within a 30-minute string quartet is a very extreme contrast. As such, it would require some kind of justification, perhaps a special storyline. If the music has no explicit program, this would just sound silly. Another possibility would be to follow up on this contrast. After first hearing the players sing, they could begin to develop some kind of dialogue between the normal string sound and the vocal interjections. In other words, contrast can be gradually led up to, or it can be justified by what happens afterwards. In both of these cases, however, the composer will have to create a situation where, at least in retrospect, the music's evolution makes sense. This is a narrative approach, not in the sense that there must be a specific storyline, but in the sense that, as humans, we are always trying to make sense of what's going on. In a piece of music, this implies that what happens shouldn't sound just arbitrary. Despite John Cage's ideas of chance music, not all random possibilities are equally convincing to the listener. While chance may occasionally result in something interesting, usually it just sounds arbitrary. So up to here we've looked at two aspects of the composer's sense of form: convincing continuity and the need to renew interest with contrast. And I must emphasize again that these are matters of degree, not just black and white. Often when a mature composer listens to a sketch, they'll feel, it's getting boring there, I need a little more novelty, Or the opposite, these constant contrasts are getting incoherent, I need more connection. And getting these things right can take a lot of work. This is a big part of the composer's craft. A third aspect of the composer's sense of form is what I call progression or direction. Not in the sense of a tonal harmonic progression, but rather some aspect of the music that evolves over time in a more or less predictable way. For example, a line that gradually keeps getting higher, or a large-scale gradual crescendo. These progressions are invaluable in creating successful musical forms because they create clear patterns that the listener will notice, and then the composer can play with these expectations. Progressions gradually involve the listener over time as they make internal predictions about the music direction. So, for example, I might introduce a strongly contrasting idea after a while, but it could arrive on the highest note of a long-term rising line. Although, say, the motive, harmony, etc. might change, the listener still has a sense that the new material somehow comes out of the old. Here's a short example. As it is, the new idea in the fifth bar sounds pretty surprising. But now compare this version. I've kept the contrast here, both motivic and harmonic, but now it arrives at the climax of the rising line and culminates the crescendo starting at the beginning. These two progressions, registral and dynamic, now move towards the new idea, whereas in the first version it sounds less convincing. This is especially important as another important aspect of the composer's sense of form is making a contrast feel like it arrives at just the right moment. So it's not just a matter of how much contrast, but also when it arrives. Since music is a temporal art, when something happens is at least as important as what happens. Again, this has to do with our tendency to seek narrative explanations for reality. Just like in an important film, important events need to feel connected to what's happened before, either in the sense that they evolve naturally out of the story, or, for example, when something unexpected happens, say a sudden earthquake, the reactions of the main characters are still significant to the storyline. Conventional forms, taught in this way, are a good way to develop a sense of form. Often I'm working with a student, I'll say, that's too bumpy, or it's getting monotonous. Often they'll reply that they felt something was wrong, but they didn't know exactly what. Having a well-developed sense of form means knowing what is wrong and where to look for a solution. Another aspect of this sense of form is a feeling for overall balance. For example, a ternary form with an A section that lasts 1 minute will not balance well with a B section that lasts half an hour. Overall, the proportions need to make some kind of sense. This doesn't mean that asymmetry is impossible, but just that the more difference there is between the parts of the piece, the more the emotional voyage to justify it. When I talk about an emotional voyage, I mean what, at least for me, is the goal of a serious composer: to let the listener embark on an exploration that has some kind of emotional logic and lets them experience something special. Obviously, my personal sense of form won't be the same as someone else's. Indeed, personal differences in these preferences are among the things that make one composer's music distinct from another's. Mozart and Haydn lived at the same time, but their sense of form is not quite the same. To find one's personal sense of form requires a lot of work. Composing one song isn't enough. The serious composer, who gradually works through forms that get longer and more complex, should arrive eventually at this sense of what the music needs to do. I mentioned at the start here that the form of a given piece depends on musical ideas. I'll have more to say about that in the next lesson.